Okay, so now we're going to turn it over to you, but let's keep in mind poor Dilma. She's locked in her office, and she's still looking for advice. So she's just placed a call to President Barack Obama, and unfortunately Barack is not in. But the personal assistant has said, well, let me see if I can reach him. He's playing golf right now with a major donor who's the CEO of a major energy company. But let me see if I can reach him on the golf course. So they get a hold of him, and he says, Dilma, of course I'm going to talk to you. It's a bit awkward. You know, look, I just had this kind of thing called the Keystone Pipeline, and you know, I got to tell you, one of the things that I was thinking about was it doesn't really affect too many people. They're pretty poor. They, you know, a lot of them don't even vote. And I'm going to have to move a few of them, but they're not going to put together a whole lot of political opposition. And so, gee, you know, as you start balancing that, I had to have trade-offs myself. Now, I'm oversimplifying it, but don't think in the United States that we don't have issues that we have to think about as well and make determinations over how you balance the rights of segments of the population, environmental considerations, and growth. So anyway, anybody in the audience who's going to have advice for poor Dilma or has any questions for the audience, now's the time to speak up. Oh, okay, Debbie, you're going to... Everybody will answer except me. Now it's the panel.
Yeah, anyone could answer this. In Brazil, we've been trying different ways to make poor Dilma hear. Listen to us. And there's been petitions going on, and there's been different artists making different videos and giving interviews with scientific information against Belo Monte. And my question is, what is the status of Belo Monte right now? Is there still hope that it won't happen? And what else can we do?
I think so. Well, the status is very contested. The Inter-American Commission, after pressure from Brazil, did pull back on its initial order. The initial order said, please don't build the dam until you can show you have done the consultation. The new order says, try to safeguard the life and personal integrity of the indigenous peoples. And the matter of whether you consulted is a merits matter. We're going to consider that later. This was largely viewed, I think, accurately as a step backwards in indigenous rights protection. So as an international law matter, the case is ongoing, and that's more or less where it stands. In Brazil, every once in a while, there is an order from a court with some form of jurisdiction, environmental, indigenous, or otherwise, that halts the building of the dam. The latest one happened last year. The Supreme Court overturned it. Litigation is ongoing. I think this is going to be a very long struggle. I think there is a strong chance that the dam won't be completed, but there are also very strong interests pushing for it. The Xingu movement, Alive activists around it are very, very organized. Yeah, that's, I guess, what I can say right now.
And I would just quickly, I would say that there is a role for global activism, for local, national, and global activism, to make these things known and put pressure. And because I think it's an issue of global responsibility, after all.
I went to the first meeting of the peoples of the rainforest in 1988 at the Belo Monte Dam. And we were out in the jungle in Kayapó territory. And indigenous people that had been traditional enemies, Shabanti Indians, for example, long enemies of the Kayapó, their chiefs showed up to offer solidarity with the Kayapó. From the international community, at the time, a major international recording star, Sting, showed up, and it mattered. He set up a rainforest foundation. People appreciated it. The entire world press had their eyes So earlier, Dean Maggie talked about the possibility of taking over the Amazon from an international consortium, tongue-in-cheek, I know. Obviously, nobody's going to question Brazil's sovereignty, I don't think. But international pressure is not only legitimate, but of long date. This has been going on, what's 88? It's now, it's 25 years. It's been going on, and should continue to go on because I think people like yourself have a legitimate interest in seeing human rights served. And in fact, human rights are rarely served without international observers.
Still on Belo Monte. I think it's interesting if you look at the role of the private sector, that most Brazilian financial institutions refuse to finance it because they're not in compliance with the Equator principles. So you see basically the public sector moving forward with it, and then the private construction companies. But I can't think of no local Brazilian bank who decided to finance it precisely for those reasons.
One possible thing to be done would be to go there and check both sides' arguments and have an opinion for yourself and try to defend them, because everything that goes through the media has many filters.
I'm glad that you raised the issue of energy, because I have a question about how the energy policy in Brazil has to do with the forest policy, because I think, Mr. Glazer, in your slides you showed that not only is a lot of the electricity in Brazil generated from hydroelectric sources, but also that there's a great deal of biofuels from sugarcane resources, and both of those require deforestation of some kind. So I wonder how those things relate to each other, and now with the new discovery of those large offshore oil discoveries, that how things may change in the future.
There's a professor, a former dean of the University of São Paulo, that says that there is no saint energy. So we have to make choices, and these are very difficult choices, right? There are problems with nuclear energy, there are problems with fuel, with fossil fuels. I think the question is, since it's renewable, the question is to demarcate how much one is going to use of the land and make sure that this is properly done, right? I mean, you can plant this again and again and again, right? So the sugarcane based has the propensity to be perennial. The question is it capable of supplying what Brazil needs without further deforestation? It's a technical question which I cannot answer, but I think we have the opportunity of, with technological innovation in agriculture, to make sure that a given amount of land will be sufficient at least to minimize the deforestation. Actually, this is a number that I think it's important to keep in mind. Since 2004, the degree of deforestation fell by 75%, which is a tremendous achievement. It doesn't solve this. The place is huge, the amount of deforestation, right, in nominal terms is very large, but the rate is changing very, very quickly. So I think we have an opportunity, given the endowments, given the technological capabilities, but it's an open question.
Hi, I'm Leah, I'm a senior in anthropology, and I'm back from 6 months of fieldwork in Salvador. Professor Espinosa mentioned during her presentation that a big problem for indigenous peoples in Brazil has been this kind of creation of a nation state rather than a multicultural state or a multi-ethnic state. And that is something that I saw a lot in terms of healthcare in Brazil, you know, because the needs of a black Afro-Brazilian who lives in a favela on the outskirts of Salvador and has stopped taking, who has HIV and has stopped taking his antiretroviral treatment in favor of like treatment from candomblé, is very different from the needs of an indigenous person whose lands have been invaded and their teeth are falling out because they don't have access to their original diets. So I'm just wondering how you see the idea of a multicultural and multi-ethnic state helping this in terms of healthcare, in terms of these issues with integration for indigenous peoples, and if that makes a difference, or if it really is just going to make things more chaotic than they already are in a lot of cases.
Thank you. Great question. Because usually we think about nation state and multiculturalism at usually very abstract levels, and it has, as you mentioned, very concrete implications. For example, there has been a lot of loss of traditional knowledge because of the assimilationist policies. Because the religious practices that are associated with healing were under the law, against the law. And that happened not only in Brazil, in all the countries of Latin America. You could go to jail because you were a healer, a shaman. It all it takes was a Catholic priest to point you out, and you went in jail. So that's why the practices have been very hidden. A form of resistance is always to convey that you are integrated, assimilated, while you keep hidden your religious or traditional practices. That's very common. That's why we also need to be careful what we think is assimilation or not. So, and for that, for example, a lot of healing practices are considered superstitious. From traditional help at childbirth to a lot of things are almost disappearing, no? And in some cases are gone because of this practice of hostility by the government. So the idea of having a multicultural state or pluriethnic is that we can recognize that there is knowledge and there is science in different ways, and that we can integrate modern medicine with traditional healing practices, for example. We can rely much more on participatory group, community, organizations. So we could provide a much better framework to treat them on equal basis as compared to a nation state that is always assimilating, and otherwise is not good. What is not us, like us, is really non-existent. So that could be some implications in that.
As cultures disappear, like species disappear, it's sort of like burning down libraries. Why would you want to do that? You can argue, well, library, we can use the wood to make heat. It's obvious we can burn the library and heat our houses in the winter. But that's a specious argument, obviously. There are indigenous practices which many of us in the room, I would argue, would find abhorrent, would not support. But it's hardly an argument for eliminating the entire culture and all of its practices, which is, and certain examples of abhorrent practices that a large majority of so-called Western people find abhorrent are used to justify forced assimilations, taking over of lands, or denigration in the press, all combining to undermine indigenous cultures. And so your example of curative practices is but one of many. It's also how to marry, how to raise your children, how to educate people, how to interact with the environment. All of these are paradigms that are experiments in human living, and as we ourselves are less and less satisfied with many aspects of our own paradigm, burning down libraries seems less and less of a good idea.
Can I just give one example of a common misunderstanding? So Brazilians usually say that indigenous people, you have to be careful with them because they like to steal from you, right? Don't leave anything unattended, they'll take it from you. But usually the perception is that from the indigenous point of view, we are terribly tight-fisted, which is the most terrible thing that you can be. You don't like to share, you like to accumulate, right? So when they look at that and they see, that person is committing the worst moral sin that you can ever commit. He's accumulating and he's not sharing with anyone else. Therefore, it's just legitimate that I'll take it from him and it will serve as a lesson. So, if we look at them as being stealing, they look at us as being doing something terribly wrong too. And I'm sure that they find a lot of things that we do terribly horrendous. So that's just
Hi, my name is Amanda. I'm originally from São Paulo. I'm also in the Rise of Brazil class. So along the same line of thought, my question is also related to indigenous peoples. Last week there was an event on campus by the Mexican Solidarity Network. So they were basically talking about this movement called the Zapatista movement of indigenous people who basically are seeking an autonomous state in Mexico. And basically they want to be separate and have their own rights. So my first question with that is, how do you think that that's a desire of indigenous people in Brazil to have their own autonomous state within the country? Do you think that that would be feasible? And then my second question with that is, are there any movements or networks that you know of among indigenous people in Brazil, that are seeking for these rights, and are, organizations that are seeking this? And if so, was there any thought possibly to also have their voices in this event as well, at all? Thank you.
Maybe someone else can talk about the current situation, but historically there's been this text, which is very famous, by Biorn saying, society against the state. That indigenous societies are designed in a way to prevent the emergency of a dominator, the state as a dominator figure. And then the other point of view is that the indigenous cosmology is such that it's almost the case that every person is a state in itself, and himself or herself. So, when you're asking those questions, I think we need to consider the other point of view, which is how do the indigenous people themselves will understand the concept of a state. But I think, do you have something?
Well, I just wanted to say that obviously any nation can potentially become a state. The question is, what are the international relations that that state confronts? And I think it's a very pragmatic question. What is the tactic that your nation will take? And I would argue that given the power relations between indigenous peoples in Brazil and the Brazilian state, which is a very powerful state, especially in Brazilian territory, it's a non-starter. You would simply provoke repression. And why would you want to do that to your tribe? Even if in principle, in the abstract, that's an idea, it's not pragmatic, it's not a practical approach to preserving your culture, your people. There are all sorts of things that you can do short of confronting the state, which even many members of the Brazilian state find acceptable and will support. And there are lawyers that will support you. There are politicians that will support you. There are members of civil society that will support you. But confronting the state, you see what happens in the United States when there are groups that confront the state. We have seen fires in recent history with those groups that confront the state outright. It's very dangerous.
Okay. Sure. Okay, and then we're going to let the professor have a question after that.
But also, most of the indigenous movements are looking for autonomy within the framework of the states. So the claim is more for multiculturalism or pluri-ethnic states than to form a separate entity, because as you well said, the social organization is quite fragmented. There are, especially in the case of Brazil, there are more than 200 separate nations, quite dispersed. They don't have the structure of, they're just building what is like a pan-Brazilian indigenous movement. So their quest is not for separatism, for create another state. And that's for most indigenous movements that I know. Usually that quest for autonomy is misunderstood as, oh, they want to separate. But I think they want a different kind of state, one that can accommodate different and giving them equal status.
I want to open up the dialogue to talk about the idea or like indigenous representation in this process of assimilation of indigenous people and how they've been trying to be represented in conferences such as the one that happened in Brasilia where the Caiabo intervened and they weren't allowed to go into the conference to be able to defend themselves. And I just wanted to ask you guys when you thought about indigenous representation in this process of assimilation and how it has to do with like the image that representation, whether by indigenous people or by the state, is correct and accurate in a way that the indigenous people see themselves as, and how does this play a role with defining indigenousness?
Issues of representation among indigenous people are quite tricky because first they are quite fragmented, they are quite disempowered within national states. So in many cases what you see is that they are more able to be represented in international gatherings and articulate an international movement than it is to create a national movement in their country because of the formidable obstacle they have, starting with language. In Brazil, 200 different nations, 200 different languages, and the lack of resources they face to travel to have this. Now, there are some institutions like CIMI who have been really supporting a lot of meetings and the creation of this pan-Brazilian movement, but it's tricky. It's tricky because to be able to articulate the movement, they have to go beyond their locality, right? And by doing so, they have to use technology, another language, and so on. So those who can be more, how can I say, bilingual or bicultural, to say something, are those who are elected to be representative. And those are the ones who then are accused to being not enough indigenous. So you see, it's like to be able to represent them, they have to deploy some strategies that make them easily target as, oh, you are not authentic enough. So that's why it's very common when you go to a meeting of indigenous people in Geneva, you see the Maasai, they come with their tunics, the people from the Amazon come with the feathers, because they are deploying like a strategic essentialism. They are trying affirming their difference so that they are not accused of not being authentic. So that's the dilemma they face. That's why it's so difficult to have an indigenous movement that is really representative in the sense that being elected like in a union, that kind, because the conditions are very, very challenging.
One thing just to add to that is human rights law on consultation tries to address some of the complexity, I think, without coming close to resolving it in any way, but just of taking into account traditional decision-making structures within tribal peoples, for instance. So there's a case of Saramacca versus Suriname, where in order to determine was a consultation about a gold mining initiative properly done, one of the things that the court looked at is did the people, the company and the state seek out the proper interlocutors in a culturally respectful way, in a linguistically respectful way, and so on, to account for decision-making processes that are legitimate within the tribe. But one of the interesting outcomes of some of these Suriname cases is actually the recognition of what's called juridical personality for tribes as an international human right. Meaning, if a corporation can sue in domestic courts, or an NGO can sue, or a university can sue, how come the tribal group can't sue as a group if it can meet certain requirements? And in that way, provide a legal avenue to represent themselves and seek rights in a way that is not possible if every tribe member has to sue for their particular part of the land.
Okay, so I'm going to grab the microphone. We have time for one more question and answer, because the last platter of food is being brought out, so it's going to be harder and harder to keep people from the food. So, Fernando?
So, the question maybe has been already preemptively answered by Delgado and Espinosa. I don't. You've been referring to a pluricultural, pluriethnic society, and I don't know if the Brazilian Constitution actually affirms this pluriethnicity and pluriculturalism. Well, I know that the last Ecuadorian constitution does, and it actually endows right to the land, to the land. That is a kind of a new development in the international human rights. And my second question is related to this, because it has to do with the agenda of human rights itself, that we all accept and we think is good, and definitely human rights have been changing in long history, coming from civil rights and now cultural rights and language rights. But I wonder if this, I mean, of course, this is a Western way of saying things, and it's the lingua franca through which these issues can be understood at the international arena. I wonder if this agenda of human rights is accepted by the indigenous populations, and whether also some indigenous populations who have incorporated the human rights discourse into their own discourse have contributed to it in a certain way.
Well, as to the Brazilian Constitution, I'd say what Professor Moises mentioned earlier, that the Constitution does grant indigenous land rights. So in that way, very strongly affirming of pluriculturalism, and in various other ways, it's one of these. It's written in 1988, post-dictatorship, and with a mindset of trying to be the most progressive, the most rights guaranteeing, and is very much so on paper in terms of civil, political, and economic, social, cultural rights. So if you read the Brazilian Constitution, say, I definitely want to live there. And implementation has always been the question, with some things implemented very well and various other things still struggle. On the second question
was to what extent the agenda of human rights is already, it's our vision of things, and if it's been accepted by the indigenous population.
Right, and which is a great question, and I think various very important critiques of human rights exist as to the origin of the human rights law and language, as to does it replicate imperialist tendencies, does it give enough space for contributions made by other persons, and I would say that that's a very live and important issue, and I think a lot of groups in Brazil do appear to integrate human rights discourse and activism in an instrumentalist way, as a way of achieving what is the justice that they are seeking. You'll see across Brazil and across NGOs, people deploy and understand human rights in all sorts of different ways, and none of which I would necessarily say is better or worse. I have my own philosophies, but I think that's a great question, and for human rights to be legitimate, it obviously needs to have a very real space where it can be challenged and changed and reinvented by those people who need to deploy it the most.
Okay, one last intervention.
Can I say something?
Oh, please. Two, but short.
Well, this thing of, I don't know in Brazil in particular, but at the international level, there has been a very strong synergy between human rights activism and indigenous movement, because it is different, as you will say, because it's collective rights. Most of the human rights are based on individual rights, and the indigenous movement built on collective rights, which are quite different. So I think has been a productive interaction and collaboration, but also there are a lot of non-resolved issues. A pluri-ethnic state is a state where you can be a citizen of the country and keep your ethnic affiliation. I'm not sure that Brazil is that the case. I know Ecuador is the case, Bolivia, Colombia, Like you can be Quechua and you can be Ecuadorian. Peru is not the case. You have to assimilate in order to be a citizen, and that's a very important difference.
Okay, last comment.
I just wanted to try to finish on a positive note, given the complexity of the issues, and I think there is one piece of information that I find crucial. Brazil is one of the most environmentally aware countries in the world. A recent poll shows that about 92% of the population considers the environment among the 3 most important issues that policies have to face. So I think, the more, one can co-opt the traditional Brazilian society to be engaged in those issues, the stronger the possibility of solving this in those struggles in a positive way.
Well, I'm glad you ended on that positive note, and I'm going to just end with 3 quick comments. So one, Dilma is still waiting, but fortunately she's received a phone call from her Minister of Justice telling her that this dam is being held up in litigation, and so she doesn't have to give an answer until we meet next year. So we have a little bit of time to consider this. The second, my personal observation is that Brazil as a country has made great strides, not only in terms of economic growth, in terms of some of the programs to really bring up the poorer strata of society and create an aspiring and rising middle class, and has paid a lot of attention to the environment. And I would say that if one did a case study comparing the Brazil and the United States, you might be surprised on where you would say progress has been made in Brazil compared to what the United States has done. That's not to say that more needs to be done, but simply on a comparative context. It's always important to put things within the context of comparisons to other countries versus the absolute. So with that, before we thank the panel, I do want to thank the International Center for Ethics, Justice, and Public Life, and I want to thank the Perlmutter Institute for Global Business Leadership at the Business School for sponsoring this event. And any event requires a lot of work by a lot of people, and they're in the back of your program. The print is small, which means I might not be able to read it unless I put it like this, but Debbie Barrickman, Barbara Cassidy, Shelby Maggot, Colin Mew, Barbara Strauss, Dr. Lee Swigart, Bernardo Tannenbaum, Dr. Dean Terrace, David Weinstein. All of them worked really hard, and I really do think we put our panelists through a real grueling session. So please join me in thanking them for this. All of you for being a great audience. We're ending about 30 seconds after I said, so the hors d'oeuvres are still either, can't tell if they're hot or cold, but they're fresh. So have some hors d'oeuvres, stay and talk to everybody, and thank you all very much.
Come to visit Brazil.